Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
While we're waiting, in your wisdom, when are they going to think having online Friday, Saturday evening services at shul? Months away still?
Um, wow, that's a wonderful question. Like, when are we going to be back in person for this set
Yeah,
of services and learning again?
I missed the tuna. Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, the
just
tuna.
joking. Just joking.
Oh, I was gonna talk about the mildly soggy but excellent leftover pastries.
Okay,
Those are
that's true.
my favorite. Um, that that's a very good question. I think that our next stages are weekday Mincha and Mariv
Okay.
and Sundays. And we've talked a lot about that. I can't recall if we talked about when we're coming back for this slot of time again in person. Certainly, when we do, we'll still be streaming it for a while. And my guess is that it'll be at the end of the summer.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I miss the tuna too, Gary, and people. Shabbat afternoon, Shabbat Shalom, and a happy Shabbat afternoon and evening, everybody. Shabbat Shalom to Rachel Cohen, our rabbinic intern. It's good to see everybody. Going to begin in just a moment with Mincha, the Shabbat afternoon service. I'll call pages as usual from our several different Sidorim that we use here. So I'll begin with the Sidor Lev Shalem, followed by Sim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals, the newer one, and then the uh, older edition. We begin on page 214 in Lev Shalem, 226 or 558 with Ashrei. Ashrei Yushvi Veitecha Ojelalu Chasela Ashrei Am Shekacha Lo Ashrei Am Shadonai Eloha Tila LeDavid. Tehilat Adonai Yidaber Pi Vivarech Kol Basar Shem Kodesh Leolam Vayed V'anachnu Nivarech Ya V'yitavi Ad Olam Hallelujah U'al Etzion Goel Shavi Feshav Yaakov Neuma Adonai Vanisa V'yita Kadosh Yoshev Tehilot Yisrael V'karazel Zevi Amar Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzavot Melech Kol Haaretz Kevodo V'tiseini ruach v'shmacharai kol rash gadol Baruch kivod Adonai b'mekomot Adonai yimloch le'olam v'ed. V'yivtichu v'cha yudehi shemecha ki lo azavta doreshecha Adonai Adonai chafetz leman tzidko yogdil Torah v'yadir. So we'll turn now to our Torah learning in the place of our full Torah service. So our Torah learning is our reading of the beginning of Parshat Pinchas, which can be found if you're in an Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 918. If you're following along in any kind of a Hebrew Bible, we are in the book of Bamidbar still. In chapter 25, we begin on verse 10. This is the first full aliyah. Pinchas is a familiar chapter because it's the place from which we take so many of our special weekday and holiday maftir readings when it comes to the special sacrifices that were offered, and now we read about them as reminiscences of those offerings that we give. So we read little selections from Pinchas throughout the year, and then once a year, of course, we come back around to the full parsha. So I'll begin with the blessing, thanking God for the opportunity to study Torah with all of you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, פנחס בן אלעזר בן אהרון הכהן השיב את המתי מעל בני ישראל, וקנאו את תקינתי בתוכם, ולא כיליתי את בני ישראל בקנאתי, לכן אמור, הנני נותן לו את בריתי שלום, ותעלו זרוע אחריו, ברית כהונת עולם תחת, אשר קינא לאלוהיו, וכפר על בני ישראל, בשם איש ישראל, המוכה אשר חוקה את המדיינית, זמרי בן צלו, נשיא בית אב לשמעוני, בשם האישה המוכה, המדיינית כספי בת צור, ראש אומות, בית אב במדיין הוא, וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, צרור את המדיינים, והכיתם אותם, כי צוררים הם לכם, נכליהם, אשר נקלו לכם, על דבר פאור ועל דבר כוזבי בת נשיא מדיין אחותם, המוכה ביום המגפה, על דבר פאור, ויהי אחרי המגפה, ויאמר אדוני אל משה אל אלעזר בן אהרון הכהן לאמור, שאו את ראש כל עדת בני ישראל, מבין 20 שנה ומעלה, לבית אבותם, כל יוצאי צבא בישראל, וידבר משה ואלעזר הכהן אותם, ערבות מואב, על ירדן יריחו לאמור, מבין 20 שנה ומעלה, כאשר ציווה אדוני את משה ובני ישראל, היוצאים מארץ מצרים. So let's set Pinchas aside for now. And before we move back into the service and into the Whispered Amidah, I'll ask if there's anybody who came this evening with the intention of having an El Male Rachamim said in memory of a loved one. It's commemorating Yartzeit this week in particular. Is that the case for anybody who's with us on Zoom? Okay. If there isn't anyone in particular, then we'll move now to the recitation of the private whispered Amidah for Shabbat afternoon. We can find it on page 223, 234, or 574. We recite it standing, it's whispered and private, so you'll see me step aside, and we'll give ourselves enough time to recite it and have a prayerful private moment. you haven't yet completed your own private Amidah, you can continue at your own pace. We're going to continue now with Aleinu on pages 231 or 248 or 598. I invite you to rise. Aleinu l'shabech adon hakol, l'tekidu l'alitzer bereishit shelo asanu k'yernetzor. Kakatu b'toratecha Adonai himlok le'olam va'ed, v'ne'emar v'haya Adonai l'melech al kol haaretz, v'yom hahu yihyeh Adonai echad, u'shmo echad. We continue with Mourner's Kaddish 232, 249, or 600. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei rabbah, be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chayichon v'yomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'bizman kari v'imru amen, Yehei shemei rabba mevarach, le'alam u'lamei maya. Yitbarach v'yishabach v'yitbar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha berichu. Le'ela minko birchata v'shirata, Tushbechata v'nechamata damiram be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. I'll turn this over now to our rabbinic intern Rachel Cohen to teach us, and then after we learn together, we will move on to Mariv and Havdalah.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Cantor Torney. So some of you may have the source sheet, some of you may not. We will be focusing on the daughters of Tzlofchad tonight in our learning. And people, some people may be familiar with them, some people may not. Hopefully what we're going over won't be too much repetition for those who are familiar with their story in general already. But I want to look at them as I want to look at the story unto itself, but I also want to draw out from their story larger principles about what it can mean to fight for whatever kinds of justice and social change one would hope to see in the world. So before we get into their story in particular, if you have the source sheet, you'll notice at the top, I put a series of statements for us to kind of gauge our own, where we might fall in relation to how the daughters of Tzlofchad approached their issue that they wanted to change in their social context. So I'll read them out loud because I imagine not everyone has the sheet. And the idea is to kind of at the end, I'll just ask you if any of them resonate for you, if any of them rub you the wrong way, or anything in between. So, which, if any, best describes your approach to social change or justice work? Change is slow. Sometimes the system is so flawed that you have to dismantle it and start over. It is best to partner with authority figures. Grassroots change is best. Change works best by working within the system. Any of those statements happen to resonate for y'all tonight? Yeah, is that Gary or Marlise? Someone's hand.
It's the Gary. No, change takes time. And if you speed it up too quickly, there can be problems. You don't think things through. That's
Great.
what I'm opportunity.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in? Joanna?
So I agree with what Gary said, that change takes time. I happen to have sent Rabbi Chorney an email during the week that when the new tune for Nahisha Amda came out, I was enthralled with it. And I learned it from my son, who was in Israel at the time, but I was still here in North America, and it hadn't kind of traveled the shores. And I tried to bring it to my next Seder, and there almost was a revolt. now it's a pretty common tune. It's pretty well known. It's sung at lots of seders. I've sung it at my seder with no problem. I've been to other seders. Everybody loves to sing that tune. But it's just one example. On a more serious note, I think that, and such an innocuous example, think of, when we're trying to make more dramatic change. I sort of think for me, there's like sort of three statements that you just said that need to be combined to make change. One is that I do think that you need to sort of try, if at all possible, unless the system is so completely broken, but like to work within the system. A system is in place for a reason. And if the system overall has stood the test of time, then it probably can in some way accommodate change. And I think there needs to be a meeting of the minds between whoever's considered the authority and whoever's considered the grassroots. Because if it's all authority, you won't get buy-in from the people. And if it's all people without a structure leading the change, it won't happen in, sort of an organized and systematic way, and, could lead to chaos. So I think for me, there has to be sort of a meeting of the minds of those three things.
So beautiful. Joanna so nicely, wove together several different threads of this. Speaking to both the desire for there to be lasting change that often requires working within the structures when possible. I also I love the example that you brought in the first one, because it's like whether change that we're looking for is so seemingly, innocuous or really like deeply embedded in our identities is like often the seemingly innocuous things are also deeply embedded in our identities. And, like human nature, for better or for worse, like is often the same, and how people respond is often the same. So it's just I find that just a fascinating thing about humans. Cantor Chorney?
A lot of these statements resonate with me. I'm not surprised that Gary would answer that slow change resonates with him, because I see his work and Marlise's as well in 1LA at Betham. And I know that they agree with this idea that diplomacy is this thing that just takes an enormous amount of time. That this work of social change means working to build relationships within the system that just takes so much time to eventually make progress. The additional point I wanted to make is that I think that my responses to this are colored by the amount of power that I feel that I hold in the system. I know that my comment now is also colored by knowing that you're about to speak about the Daughters of Tzlofchad, but I think that that's also important. So I am moved to be the kind of person who almost always wants to keep the system intact and would like to work with authority figures and to work to build bridges across aisles to change the system. But I acknowledge that I rarely experience the kind of disempowerment that moves me to want to completely break down walls. And I have sometimes been in conversation with other community partners who've explained to me what it is that moves them to want to break down the system. And I understand that their perspective is pretty different from mine.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that, because it often requires a certain amount of trust in the system that we will not be entirely alienated and shut down from it. Even if progress is slow, there has to be some amount of hope that we will be acknowledged as human beings in that process. And it's absolutely correct that not, for various reasons, that's not everyone's experience. So thank you for adding that layer to our discussion. Tybal?
Two things. One is a little off topic, but I hope it's okay. I go to shul for many reasons. One is tuna fish. So the notion that this normally has tuna fish, and I'm in Maryland, and even when you go back, it's just going to be really hard, even if it's hybrid, to watch you eating tuna fish, but I'll cope. But what makes it easier is one of the other reasons why I go to shul. I mean, I go for many reasons, is to watch babies and toddlers. And there was a very cute toddler, I think, maybe slightly older, at the Bima often today, in what I think is the main sanctuary. So I just wanted to say that publicly first. And then say, the thing about that sometimes the only way to make change is to take the system down completely. Granted, I'm near the end of my life from the beginning of the life, but to me that seems like this really naive notion that human nature will change. I mean, that human nature can be changed. It's just structural. It's just a system. It's something. It just seems like a very young thing to say. Not young in the good way that the little girl, well, her daddy was leading. That was just so cute.
That's my son Yossi.
No, I thought it was a little. Are you waiting for an Sheeran?
Yes.
Yes, we did an Sheeran too.
He turns 3 in July 23rd. And it's gonna kill me to cut those curls though. You see them. But I'm glad that it brought you joy to have him at the Bima. I didn't get to see him up there, but I heard he was
You were on the field. Oh, he was so cute.
Field, but I heard he was up at the Bima. Yeah.
My cute toddler is sleeping, but in any case, yes, like what I hear you saying is that that there's like an element of perhaps naivete if one is looking to dismantle an entire system, that that there is something even better to replace it with, perhaps at all. Okay, so without we could, there's so many contemporary examples, when the discussions of policing in America, for instance, that's like on my mind right now. Without, we could talk for the whole time about our own personal views on that, which we won't for the moment. But I'm just saying, I when I'm thinking about Benot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, and these principles we've discussed, like it's I really see it as not theoretical, and so that's part of why I hope we can draw some inspiration from their methodology, whether it's our preferred way of doing things or not, to see what value it can hold for us today as well. All right, so let's jump into looking at their story. If you're following along in a Chumash, we're starting in the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 27, verse 1, starting right there. I will I'll read for now and kind of just feel free to interrupt at any point with questions, thoughts, comments, etc. Okay, so the daughters of Tzlofchad, a Manassite family, son of Chayfer, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Yosef, came forward. So we have like their family lineage, and it says that these daughters came forward. The names of the daughters were Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcha, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, which banded together against the Lord, but died of his own sin. And he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen." So they're about to be distributing land along tribal lines, essentially. And most of the inheritance generally went through, like a father's lineage. So it would be passed from father to son and other male relatives. So these daughters are in a unique situation where they're saying, our father died. He wasn't part of those Korach, troublemakers. He died of his own sins, kind of, big. There's lots of commentary about that. But point being, he died. He wasn't a Korach follower, and he doesn't have any sons. So we don't want his name to be his lineage and his name to die out with him. So please give us a holding among our father's kinsmen. Like when you're distributing the allotments for his tribe and his clan, please include us at, presumably as you would if we were sons instead of daughters. So my first question upon reading this is, obviously it takes some chutzpah, some guts. They're very brave to bring this forward. But I'm curious in how you're reading it, whether from what's actually on the page or kind of how you imagine the situation would be. do you think their goal is just to bring their own personal case, or do you think they're trying to make broader institutional change?
I think a person, this is my negative side, but I think they're being greedy, or not negative greedy, but in the sense they want their share of the estate, and that's how they live, and that's how they're going to be surviving as well. There's nobody taking care of them per se, So I think they want some part of his share, and because they're using the word in the name. Ideally, they're going to get married as well too and lose that name, but that's a separate issue. But I think they want the way that this is known as his father's property, and they're going to get a piece of that.
Right. There's a practical concern, and they are looking to help their situation. Okay, great. Yeah, Marlies.
I guess I'm just not sure if I read this in there, but it seems to me there's some feeling of wanting some justice, for what is right, just in the way it's presented. And that's what I imagine. And the fact that they, as well as, thinking about their father and their family, that his name not be lost, and that it, that they get, yes, there is definitely thinking of their own well-being, because if it just is no longer, if they're, dependent on somebody else outside of the family, it may not go as well for them. But even if he had sons, you presume that perhaps the son would be thinking about his sister's well-being as well. So I'm just thinking that there's justice and wanting their father's name to be carried on.
Right. So the part of it is also beyond themselves, beyond their current practical concern. So yes, I think that's definitely in there. And also, I mean, it's dramatic. They're saying, like, they were speaking before Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chieftains and the whole assembly. Like, if it had really been just, we need to make sure we have food and da 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 da. Like, they maybe could have had a smaller ask. So it is, there does seem to be like a principle that they're fighting for. Okay, great. Joanna?
Two things. One is, it sort of fascinates me that, like, from the giving of the 10 Commandments until this point in the Torah, like, we've had almost 2 books worth of Torah laws, many of which anticipate situations that could not possibly have been lived in the desert, right? Like, so they were like laws for future times, laws of, like, let's think of things that may come up in the future and what will be the law to deal with them. And this doesn't come up, right? So it's sort of fascinating, like, what does get into the corpus up until this time, and that no one anticipated that, hey, a dad could have only daughters, and what's going to happen to the land then. The other thing I think of in terms of, like, how does change come, or how do changes to laws come, is when it's personal. Like, it has to be personable and relatable. So that happens, I think, in one of 2 ways. Either, like in this scenario, because it's very personal, it's happening to them, or someone else learns of a situation, but in order to, like, connect to it, you have to find that connection point, that way in which it's personal to you. I think that's a lot of the reason, for example, that in our tradition, so much is about, remember you were slaves in Egypt, remember you were once a stranger in a strange land, because then that becomes a connection point for us to connect to other things. So similarly here, so I think it, at one and the same time, it could be both. It's personal, and now that this personal thing has come up, it makes us realize that change, systematic as change is needed across the system for everyone, not just for this one family.
Right. They were doing the personal is political.
Right, exactly. Much shorter and succinct.
No, it's all good, which is, like, a principle that people didn't start writing about for much longer after the Torah was written. But I think it's in there in what they're doing. Okay, great. Tybal.
I'm going to disagree a little bit because I don't think this could mean what it says on the face.
Okay.
They didn't have surnames. No matter what they did, married, not married, they were always going to be whoever they were, Tirzah, daughter of Zelophehad. They married, their name doesn't change. Same thing was true for men. That's still the way we do religious names. We know it was done that way even earlier in the Torah. So when it says his name will be lost, that can't be it, because the reality is, even if it were an only male line by the grandson, it's not caring. It's, let me do this. It's Jacob, the son of Isaac. It's not the name of Abraham is gone already. So when it says the thing about his name will be lost, it can't mean, it can't be the pshat. It's got to be something else. Because the only time when it might be slightly different, but it would be from birth, is if there was a levirate marriage thing. I mean, which doesn't apply here. But the only time you weren't the son or daughter of the first name of your parents, and that changed every generation. So I just think the name, it's not the Shem, it's maybe the standing somehow. The authority is the wrong word, but just that here was someone with a lot of children who happened to, those female children, the memory of who he was, particularly since he was this righteous person who didn't rebel, how to keep that memory alive. And maybe that was eventually going to have something to do with land, where when people passed through the land, but not completely, because the lands were going to revert always back to the tribe, and the sabbatical is why they get limited who they can marry anyway. But it was just a point about, I think we read it differently because we're used to, in our Western notion, that surnames might change. This doesn't apply.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The name can be a broader concept about standing, power, many different things. Okay, great, Joanna, and then we'll go to the next source.
I think name here can be a little bit of a, not literally the name, but like a broader meaning that we use even today of like legacy, right? So legacy is so tied in. And I think we know, like I'm thinking about now, like the book of Ruth, and I feel like in that story, name, land, inheritance, legacy is all one very interconnected idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. I think for sure, building on Tyball's point there. So let's go on to see how this grievance that they've brought is addressed by Moses and then others. So this is one of the cases in the Torah where it says Moshe brought the case before God. Like Moses, was like, don't know, gotta consult my manager. And there's many different commentaries about why Moshe had to go to Hashem at all. So some people say like he hadn't learned that law. Some people say he had learned it, but had just slipped his mind in that moment and forgot it. But this midrashic commentary that I brought, I think speaks to, alongside what was happening with Moshe, it gives us some of the backstory about that, kind of how they worked through and with the system to try and achieve their goal. So we read, and this is the midrash under section number 2, if you're on the source sheet. A midrashic approach. The daughters of Zelophehad did not approach Moses, the high priest, and the elders in the first instance, but had approached judges of lesser stature in order to give them due respect. The various levels of judges, and so then it names like the chiefs who were in charge of 50 people, and then the chiefs who were in charge of 100 people, the kind of, you think about like different layers of the court system today, kind of similar to that. Each of them displayed respect to the higher levels and saying, oh, I'm going to kind of defer to my superior. I'm going to kind of defer to my superior, and so on progressively through the judiciary system. Moshe saw how these others responded and accordingly granted respect to God for a ruling. So he kind of saw how each of the prior judges had passed this case up to a superior. And so he said, oh, I should consult my superior also. And that is why he he went to God. This is the reason that we read Vayakriv Moshe et Mishpatan Lifnei Hashem. Moses brought their case before God. So what I think is fascinating there is that in addition to what we read in that opening section about, they brought their case before all these people, it seems like actually before that moment, they worked through every possible layer of the system. They started with, they were trying to cross all their T's and dot all their I's. It seems like do everything really by the book of like how judicial matters would be handled. And that before it got to that kind of dramatic point we read in the opening where they're like speaking to everyone, that they went through the different levels. So, if it already seemed like they were kind of playing by the rules to change the rules, then I think that for me, this kind of like leveled up the impression about them doing that, because they went through a long, tedious process, they worked through the bureaucracy, the red tape, and they were willing to do that to get what they were looking for. And to kind of go back to Cantor Torney's point, that that must have required some amount of sense of power, perhaps in, working through the system for them to trust that they were going to keep pushing to have their case go through these, 5-6 different levels of review before they got a final verdict. Any other thoughts, questions about that one take on the midrashic backstory? Okay, great. So we'll go on to what I have as source 3 here, the actual ruling after this consultation with Moses' superior, in other words, God. God said to Moses, the plea of the daughters of Tzlofchad is just. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them. So this verse I pointed out on the source sheet has an interesting thing where there's like a lack of clarity in the genders when they're saying, when God is saying them, meaning the daughters, where in one point it says lahem, which is masculine, and another point it says avihen, their father, which is feminine. And, most likely it's like editorial mistake. There's different ways you could interpret this. What I thought what was interesting, and my kind of drosh on this experience was like, there's debate amongst different strands of feminism, let's say, about like how much are people trying to work their way like into the successes of the patriarchy versus dismantle it. Like how much were they trying to be like get the same rights as men? How much were they trying to like appear as men in order to get what they wanted versus being strong women to achieve the goal, like the goals of women? Just kind of like a side note that I don't think is necessarily in the story even, but I think because the language is interesting, I kind of, that's just where my mind was going with that. Cause there's a couple times in this story where the language is not clear. Like almost as if when Moses is, or God is talking about the case, they don't even always have feminine language to describe like what's going on because there isn't really a precedent for it. Okay, so that ruling seems very clear about what God wants to happen in their case. What I think is less clear, at least from the shot, which is why we, kind of start going to commentary, is how much did this change extend beyond their specific case? And, how much was it about specifically what should the Benot, the daughters of Tzlofchad get versus like what happens in general if somebody doesn't have to inherit their property. So what we get from the Peshat is this, we're in Numbers 27 verse 8 or source 4 on the source sheet. Further, speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers. If his father had no brothers, you shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. This shall be the law of procedure for the Israelites in accordance with God's command to Moses. So God kind of adds an addendum saying, in addition to what I've just told you about how to handle their case, here are these broader principles, like where this inspired an amendment to the Constitution, you could say, because we saw there was something left out. So already we see it kind of extends beyond their case somewhat. And then there's a piece by Ramban that I think, in his view, it would expand it even more. So Ramban adds, this shall be the law of procedure for the Israelites, meaning this is the judgment that shall be for all future generations, and not only for now when they were inheriting the land of Israel. So Ramban is making sure to clarify, this is taking place in the context of, what's happening when they arrive in Canaan, and what are the tribal holdings supposed to be. And Ramban is clarifying, he's like, no. So just in case you weren't sure how to, like we run into this all the time with how different people interpret what the founding fathers meant by specific words. Ramban is sort of saying, just in case you thought God's explanation meant this is how you should handle things when you're assigning tribal property, when you're entering the land of Israel, Ramban is saying, no, it's not only that, it's for all future generations as well. So Ramban, I think, is making it an even more expansive case for saying we're changing how inheritance works along gender lines, and we're making more room for someone with only daughters to have their inheritance be passed down to them. Any thoughts, questions, comments before we kind of zoom back out to our opening principles? Okay, so we've seen that the model in general of the Daughters of Silchad is one of trying to change the system from within. They certainly partner with authority figures of Moshe and according to the Midrash we read, other chieftains along the way as well. And they, what they end up achieving is a measure of success for what they're looking for, and different interpretations of how much that applied to, people beyond them as well. So I'd like to kind of, just for closing, go back to those opening statements if you have them, or I can kind of remind you of them. The statements like, change is slow. Sometimes the system is so flawed you have to dismantle it entirely. It is best to partner with authority figures. Grassroots change is best. Change works best by working within the system. Do you think there are any of those that the Daughters of Silchad, like if you could interview them after this experience, what do you think their philosophy would have been? Marlies?
Well, it certainly seems like they're working within the system. I don't know if I would say they actually, sorry, I didn't mean to take off. I don't know that they were partnering with authority figures so much as, going to the authority figures and asking, requesting, but not necessarily as full partners, is what I'm saying. But but certainly they respected the authority figures and they were trying to work within the system.
Mm-hmm. Any other reads on their situation, or what they might have been thinking? Do you think they were successful? Like, would they have been happy with the outcome? Joanna, sorry, I asked two different questions. Respond to whatever you want.
So just a little bit broader on my take on this whole thing. I'm fascinated when it's referred to, when they say to kote, right? Like when it's referred to that it's not just like Cain, so go ahead and do this, but the word, to use the word tzedek there, that it's not just that they were asking the right question, they were righteous in what they were doing. and I think that there's like a big clue there is, do you come out of resentment and anger, or do you come from a righteous place in terms of, wanting to make change? Um, it reminds me a little bit, I mean, it's a little bit different, the context, but like when we talk about, having arguments over Torah, do we do them, the way Hillel did, or, going back to last week's Parsha, do we do them the way Korach did, right? Like, are we doing it l'shem shamayim, for us, with good intent and goodwill, from the outset? And, so there was something very righteous about I would argue, not only the question, but their approach to their question that, allowed the question to be pursued and responded to the way
Right. Yeah.
that it was. And I think there's a big clue there about, how to go about change.
Right.
And just to say one more thing about it, the other thing that just jumped into my mind is the verse that we're going to get to towards the end of the Torah, right? Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, right? It's not like stand by and wait for it to happen. It's pursue it, run after it. And I think that there's also something to that. Like, don't just sit back passionately and wait for it to happen. You've got to actively, it's active justice.
Right. That they were modeling that. And you bring in the very important element of intent, that it's not only the steps that you would choose to, it's not just what you're doing, but also how you do it. And I think that's such a beautiful, like, we'll kind of draw to a close there, of that the spiritual piece of not only what are you doing to pursue justice, but how internally and hopefully also externally are you exuding a sense of, like, we're working for a cause of justice, and not, not only anger, perhaps, though that may be motivating and in the mix as well. So I hope that when we think about different Torah paradigms for pursuing justice, that this will be, along with the midwives in Exodus who defied Pharaoh, and other people who stood up to each other, and machloket l'shem shamayim, that the daughters of Tzlopchad will be for you one of the models you can hold as a Torah, a Jewish way of going about pursuing justice. Tybal, quick closing thoughts.
Quick one, and just to remember that it's in Bamidbar where Moses is referred to as a nursing father for the people. It's elsewhere in Tanakh, but in Torah, it's in Bamidbar, which is something interesting to think about in terms of women, men, gender roles.
Mm-hmm. There's feminist possibilities in there for sure. All right, so let us turn to our Mariv service, beginning on page 264, 281, or 200. Vehu rachum yachaver v'lo yashchit, behir bala shiva povlo, ya'ir kol chamato, Adonai Hoshia hamelach ya'anenu v'yom korenu. Adonai l'melech. Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uvin laila, Adonai tzivahot shemo, El chai v'kayam tamidim lo chaleinu leolam va'ed, Baruch ata Adonai, hama'ari v'aravim, Ahavat olam beit Yisrael. Ve'ahavatecha al tasir mimenu leolamim, Baruch ata Adonai ohev amo Yisrael, El melech ne'eman, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai echad. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Emet ve'amuna kol zot v'kayam aleinu. Umalchuto b'ratzon kiblu alehem Moshe u'bnei Yisrael lecha'anu shira B'simcha rabba ve'amru chulam Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai Mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh Lo tehilot osef eleh Malchutecha ra'u v'necha bokei hayam lifnei Moshe Ze elianu ve'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed V'ne'emar kipad Adonai et Yaakov Uge'alo miyad chazak mimenu Baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael. Hashivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom. Ushmor tzeitenu voenu l'chaim u'l'shalom me'atah ve'ad olam. Baruch atah Adonai shomer amo Yisrael la'ad. Baruch Adonai le'olam amen ve'amen. כי המלכות שלך היא ולעולמי עד תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו. We will skip Chatzi Kaddish and go to the whispered Amidah. And please just add in the additions for the conclusion of Shabbat. Ose shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'imru, imru, amen. If you're still finishing your Amidah, please feel welcome to continue at your own pace. And we will continue if you're in Lev Shalom or Zim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals. We'll just be skipping the Chatzi Kaddish. And if you're in the full Zim Shalom, we'll jump to page 684, the concluding verses after the conclusion of Shabbat. V'hino Adonai Eloheinu aleinu u'ma'aseh yadenu konena aleinu u'ma'aseh yadenu konenehu. Yikra'eni ve'enehu imo anochi v'tzara achaltzehu ve'achabdehu orech yamim aspiehu ve'arehu bishuati orech yamim aspiehu ve'arehu bishuati ve'ata kadosh shetzilot Yisrael v'karav ze'el ze ve'amar kadosh 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 Adonai tzvaot velo chol ha'aretz kivodo. V'tisa'eni ruach ve'shema acharei kol rash gadol, baruch kevod Adonai mimkomo. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. ויבטחו בך יודעי שמך כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה וידיר. Now to the Aleinu. Aleinu לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גאולה ליוצר בראשית. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר היה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד. קדיש יתום mourners Kaddish. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל. בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה בחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו amen. So we will now conclude our Shabbat together with Havdalah. I will nigun us into just getting my materials in order. You can grab your Havdalah set if you would like to. Yanai nai 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 yanai nai 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 The matches are not working well. I need to use another one. Hopefully this one will be the one. Not having luck. All right, here we go. There we go. Na, 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 na. Do, 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 do. הנה אל ישועתי, אפתח ולא אחד, כי עוזי וזמרת יד, אדוני ויהי לי לישועה, ושתתי מים בששון, מן מעייני הישועה, לאדוני הישועה, על עמך ברכתך צלה, אדוני צבאות. Imanu miskav lanu Elohei Yaakov Selah Adonai Tzebaot Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Yaneinu V'yom Kareinu LaYehudim Hayta Orah בשמחה וששון ויקר כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועת אשא ובשם אדוני אקרא ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם Borei peri agapen, Baruch ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Borei minei besamim. Baruch ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Borei melrei ha'esh. Baruch ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, המבדיל בין קודש לחול, בין אור לחושך, בין ישראל לעמים, בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה. ברוך אתה אדוני, המבדיל בין קודש לחול. המבדיל בין קודש לחול, חול, חול, חטאותינו הוא ימחול. זרענו וכספנו ירבה ירבה כחול, וככוכבים בלילה. זרענו וכספנו ירבה ירבה כחול, וככוכבים בלילה. שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב. שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב. אליהו הנביא, אליהו התשבי, אליהו, אליהו, אליהו הגלעדי. במהרה בימינו יבוא אלינו, עם משיח בן דוד, Mashiach ben David. Wishing you all a very sweet, sweet week ahead. I apologize, I've kept you a few minutes over. Pleasure to be with all of you tonight, and thank you so much for sharing in the Zoom space and learning. Shavua Tov and Laila Tov.
Beautiful Havdalah, worth staying an extra few minutes.
Rachel, what time is it supposed to end?